Nick had always thought of himself as a dependable husband. He wasn't one for grand gestures, nor was he without flaws, but for 30 years he'd been there for his wife, Allison. They had weathered life's storms together, raising two daughters who were now both married, buying a house, and handling the everyday stresses of work and family. Their marriage had its ups and downs, sure, but Nick believed their bond was firm, built to last. His whole life revolved around that certainty. Lately, though, something had changed. It was subtle at first. Little things that Nick couldn't quite put his finger on. Allison seemed distracted, often preoccupied during dinner, or smiling at her phone as she typed out messages with a kind of focus and joy that made Nick feel left out. She started going out more, claiming she was meeting with friends he'd never heard of. And then there was the gym, her new obsession. She was suddenly spending hours there, nearly every day. Nick brushed off his unease at first, chalking it up to the normal ebb and flow of a long-term marriage. Everyone needed their space, right? But the nagging feeling that something was wrong persisted, refusing to be ignored. One night, Nick sat alone in the living room, the low hum of the TV the only sound in the house. It was a familiar scene, him on the couch, waiting for Allison to come home from another late night out. But tonight, the loneliness pressed in harder. The clock ticked past midnight, and his patience wore thin. He glanced over at the mantel where a family photo stood, a snapshot from a sun-soaked beach vacation long ago. The three of them, all smiling under the bright sky. Nick stared at his younger self in the photo, arms wrapped around Allison and their daughters, and felt a sharp pang of nostalgia. That happiness seemed like a distant memory, a life slipping away from him piece by piece. Allison finally walked through the door. Well after 1 a.m., Nick's heart sank as he looked up, questions he was afraid to ask weighing heavily on his mind. She was dressed differently. Heels, a sleek black dress that clung to her figure, her hair styled just right. The faint scent of cologne, not his, hung in the air, mixing with her perfume, and it hit Nick like a gut punch. His chest tightened. "Hey," he said, trying to sound calm, but his voice cracked. Allison barely glanced his way, her eyes distant and tired. She murmured a quick, "Hi," kicked off her shoes, and headed straight for the bedroom without a second look. Her pace quickened, like she couldn't wait to put distance between them. Nick stayed frozen on the couch, watching her walk away. No kiss, no goodnight, not even a touch on the arm. Just a hollow routine. It hadn't felt like their bed in months. Nick's thoughts tumbled into a chaotic mess. Where had she been? Who had she been with? Was she coming home late from dancing, drinking, maybe even with someone else? He wanted to demand answers, but fear held him back. Fear of what he might hear. Fear of breaking the fragile facade that had held their life together for so long. So, he sat in silence, gripping the couch arm until his knuckles turned white, letting the unspoken tension hang thick in the air. When Allison closed the bedroom door behind her, the loneliness Nick felt was suffocating. She was only a few steps away, but he had never felt more alone. The following weeks were a blur of mounting tension. The distance between them gnawed at Nick every day. Their once easy conversations had become stilted and strained, as though they were strangers making awkward small talk. Allison's frequent outings only added to Nick's growing paranoia. She was always busy, with vague excuses that made little sense. One evening, as Allison got ready for another one of her late-night gym sessions, something inside Nick snapped. He watched her as she fussed over her appearance, her hair styled to perfection, her makeup carefully done. It didn't look like she was heading to a gym. A tight knot of unease twisted in his stomach. When she kissed him goodbye, it felt cold, like a hollow formality. The moment the door shut behind her, Nick made up his mind. He couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a constant loop of doubt and suspicion. Grabbing his car keys, he left the house, determined to follow her and find out the truth once and for all. Keeping a careful distance, he trailed Allison's car, his heart pounding as they wove through the streets. Each turn tightened the knot in his chest. Eventually, Allison pulled into the parking lot of a gym across town. Nick parked a block away, far enough to avoid being seen, but close enough to watch the entrance. He waited. Minutes dragged into hours, and with every passing second, his thoughts spiraled into darker territory. Was she really at the gym, or was this just another cover? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, The door swung open. Allison stepped out, but she wasn't alone. Nick's heart sank. She walked out arm in arm with a man, much younger, maybe in his late 20s, his air of casual confidence only stoking the fire in Nick's gut. They laughed together, too close, too comfortable. They made their way toward a nearby bar, her body language screaming familiarity. The look she gave him, full of warmth and carefree joy, was a look Nick hadn't seen from her in years. Nick's fingers dug into the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white under the dim streetlights. The sight of Allison and the younger man laughing together, so intimate, so comfortable, made his blood boil. Rage surged through him, blurring his vision. He wanted nothing more than to throw open the car door, march across the street, and demand answers, to tear apart the illusion she had been spinning right in front of him. Yet, something kept him rooted in place. Maybe it was the disbelief, or maybe it was the anger so deep it froze him. Either way, he sat there, paralyzed, watching through the window as they continued their little charade. Inside the bar, they were oblivious to the world outside, wrapped in their own bubble of shared laughter and drinks. Every smile she flashed, every touch she offered, twisted the knife deeper into Nick's heart. The man leaned in close, whispering something in Allison's ear that made her laugh. That same laugh that used to be just for him. She swatted playfully at the younger man, her eyes glowing with amusement. It was unbearable, and yet Nick couldn't bring himself to look away. When they finally left the bar, well after midnight, Nick's heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. His pulse echoed in his ears, blocking out everything else as he tailed them, staying far enough behind so they wouldn't see him. Every step they took together, every casual touch, was like gasoline poured on the fire raging inside him. He clung to a thin thread of hope that maybe they would part ways, that he had somehow imagined the intimacy between them. But when they turned toward a nearby hotel, walking hand in hand like carefree lovers, that hope shattered. He parked a few blocks away, his breath uneven, chest tight, as if his lungs had forgotten how to work. From the safety of his car, he watched them stroll into the hotel lobby. They moved with the ease of a couple, with no secrets, no shame. His heart lurched as they disappeared into the building, leaving him staring at the revolving doors as they spun emptily. The rage that had simmered in him earlier had now solidified into something colder, something far more dangerous. His hands shook, but not from fear, from a clarity that came only when all hope was lost. Allison's betrayal wasn't just a momentary lapse, an impulsive fling. It was deliberate, cold, heartless. As Nick sat in the silence of his car, staring at the hotel entrance, he felt the darkness settle over him like a shadow. There was no turning back now. That night, sleep was an impossible dream. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind a relentless whirlpool of thoughts. Images of Allison and that man together flashed behind his eyes every time he closed them, each one cutting deeper than the last. The betrayal was an open wound, festering with each hour that passed. He couldn't stop the thoughts spiraling through his mind. Her smile, her laughter, the touch she reserved for a man who wasn't him. Rage mixed with sorrow, fueling a desire for revenge that was growing impossible to ignore. By the time dawn began to creep through the curtains, Nick's mind was made up. He couldn't keep living like this, swallowed by the deceit, the lies. He had to confront her, force her to face what she had done and make her own up to it. The truth, no matter how painful, was better than living in this torturous limbo. The next morning, Nick was a storm barely contained. He moved through the motions of his routine, though nothing felt the same. Every sound, every movement grated against him. Allison moved around the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she made breakfast, her actions calm, almost serene. The sight of her acting so normal, so untouched by guilt, made his blood boil. How could she be so unaffected, so distant? Didn't she feel any remorse for what she had done? Didn't she feel the destruction she had left in her wake? When she finally sat down with her cup of coffee, oblivious to the weight of the moment, Nick couldn't hold back any longer. Who was he? The words came out low, a barely contained snarl, but they were filled with the force of his pent-up fury. Allison looked up, startled by the venom in his voice. Her eyes widened for a second before narrowing with confusion. "Who are you talking about?" she asked, her tone too casual, too rehearsed. "The young man from last night," Nick growled, his eyes hard and unyielding. "The one you were laughing with, holding hands with. Don't play dumb, Allison. I followed you." For the briefest of moments, panic flashed in Allison's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by an almost infuriating calmness. She took her time, sipping her coffee slowly, before setting the cup down with an exaggerated sigh. "Nick, it's not what you think," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, as if explaining something to a child. "It was just a bit of fun, nothing serious." "Fun?" Nick's voice trembled, fury barely contained. "Sneaking around behind my back with someone half your age is fun to you? Do you even realize how twisted that sounds?" Allison rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair, exasperation written all over her face. "Oh, come on, Nick. Don't be so dramatic. We've been married for 30 years. People change. I've changed. Did you think I would stay the same forever?" Nick's pulse thundered in his ears. "So what? You're just going to throw away everything we've built together because you're bored? Because you want excitement?" She shrugged, her indifference only fanning the flames of his anger. "It's not about throwing anything away. I'm just enjoying myself. Maybe you should try it sometime." "Enjoying yourself?" Nick spat the words out, bitterness coating his tongue. "By tearing apart our family? What about our daughters, Allison? What about the life we built?" Allison shrugged again, her dismissiveness cutting deeper than any confession ever could. "They're adults now, Nick. They'll understand. Besides, we both know this marriage hasn't been working for years. Maybe it's time we both moved on." Nick stared at her, disbelief mingling with his rage. "Moved on? You mean you're ready to walk away from 30 years like it's nothing? Like I'm nothing?" "Don't be so melodramatic," Allison replied with a dismissive wave. "It was just a bit of fun. It doesn't have to mean anything." But to Nick, it meant everything. In that moment, the last remaining pieces of his love for her shattered, crumbling into dust. For years, he had sacrificed, compromised, and believed in their future. And now she was telling him it was meaningless, a phase she was ready to leave behind. The fury that had burned inside him all night crystallized into something cold and unyielding. Allison had made her choice, and now, so would he. The following evening, Nick found himself standing in a place he never thought he'd return to. Outside the dimly lit bar where the truth about Allison and her young lover had first come crashing down on him. The flickering neon sign above the entrance cast a cold, artificial glow over the pavement, making everything seem more surreal. Nick lingered in the shadows, his emotions roiling in a storm of rage, pain, and disbelief, replaying the betrayal he had witnessed the night before in an endless, torturous loop. He had hoped for clarity, for a way to make sense of it all, but instead, the weight of Allison's infidelity pressed harder, suffocating him. Inside, the bar buzzed with the usual noise, laughter, conversations, the clinking of glasses. But for Nick, it was all just meaningless static, a distant hum against the twisted drama unfolding in his life. His eyes fixed on Allison and the younger man as they walked in, so close to each other it made his skin crawl. They weren't hiding it anymore, not even trying to be discreet. There was no secrecy left, only a bold, unapologetic display of affection that turned Nick's stomach. Their laughter blended into the bar's din, but to him, it was like nails on a chalkboard. He stayed in the shadows, unnoticed, watching as they found a booth near the back, the same booth they had occupied the night before. They ordered drinks, their conversation animated, filled with the kind of smiles and touches that once belonged to him. Every touch, every shared laugh was a fresh wound, deeper than the last. The low light of the bar did nothing to hide the warmth between them. The way she leaned into the younger man, her hand resting on his arm for just a second too long. The way she looked at him with a softness Nick hadn't seen in years. Time stretched in that bar, each minute dragging Nick further into his personal hell. His thoughts spiraled, torn between the overwhelming pain of betrayal and the ever-growing darkness of his anger. He couldn't tear his eyes away, even though part of him screamed to leave, to walk away before the hatred consuming him swallowed him whole. But his feet stayed rooted to the ground, his body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. Hours passed before they finally left the bar. their bodies still impossibly close, Allison's arm linked with her lover's. Nick followed, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his heart hammering in his chest. They were too engrossed in each other to notice him trailing behind, too wrapped up in their betrayal to care about anything else. Step after step, Nick's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of fury and despair, the distance between them narrowing with each heartbeat. They wandered aimlessly for a while, laughing softly in the cool night air, until they reached a secluded park. The air was thick with the scent of grass, the only sounds the soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. The park was empty, a quiet, hidden stage for what felt like the final act of their treachery. Nick watched as the younger man pulled Allison into his arms, their bodies melding together in the dim light, their whispers barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. Then, the younger man's voice, dripping with arrogance, pierced the night. "She's mine for tonight, old man," he sneered, his words like a blade slicing into Nick's heart. "We're going to have a wild time until we're satisfied." Allison's laughter followed, cruel and dismissive. She turned, her eyes gleaming with mockery, as she walked toward Nick, her steps slow, deliberate. Her smirk was almost unbearable as she placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch more like a shove into the abyss than any form of affection. "Don't worry, darling," she purred, her voice laced with condescension. "I'll be back when I'm done." And then she turned away, her laughter trailing after her as she rejoined her lover, leaving Nick standing alone, paralyzed by the crushing realization that there was no coming back from this. Her words, her actions, had severed any last thread of hope he might have clung to. As they disappeared into the shadows, something inside Nick snapped. It was a final, irrevocable break, a dark crack that shattered the remnants of who he had once been. Where there had once been hope, love, even sorrow, there was now only a burning need for revenge. The next few days passed in a haze for Nick, each one an agonizing blur of anger and pain. The image of Allison laughing, her hand resting so easily on that younger man's arm, haunted him every waking moment. He couldn't escape the sound of her laughter, the sight of her smug, careless gaze, the weight of her mockery. Her casual dismissal of their life together was unbearable, a constant torment that left him hollow. Every emotion was drained from him except for one, the consuming need to make them pay. He tried to go about his daily life, but nothing felt real anymore. Food had no taste, sleep evaded him, and work became a series of meaningless tasks that he performed in a daze. His colleagues noticed the change, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he seemed lost in thought, detached from the world around him, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. Nick was unraveling, and anyone who looked at him could see it. It was in the quiet stillness of another sleepless night that the idea first took root. At first, it was just a passing thought, something dark that shocked him with its intensity. But as the days wore on, that thought grew, taking shape until it solidified into something cold and deadly. If Allison thought she could walk away from their life, if she believed she could mock him and move on without consequence, she was wrong. Terribly wrong. Nick began planning. His mind, once fogged with grief, now worked with precision, fueled by his simmering rage. He watched them closely, tracking their every move. He knew their routine now, the places they went, the times they met, how long they stayed together. His obsession consumed him. He noted every detail, their favorite bars, the days they most often met, the parks they walked through. Each piece of the puzzle fell into place, and his need for revenge only grew stronger. But it wasn't enough to watch. Nick needed more. He needed to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no mistakes. So he crossed a line he never thought he would. He bought a gun. The transaction was disturbingly easy. The exchange of cash for cold, unfeeling metal in his hand surreal. Holding it felt like stepping into a nightmare, but one he couldn't wake from. This was his reality now. He practiced with it, feeling the weight of it in his hands, each shot at the range releasing a fraction of the fury that had been building inside him. Each bullet was a promise, a vow of the vengeance he would soon deliver. He hid the gun away, his dark secret, waiting for the moment to come. That moment arrived sooner than he had expected. The night was cool, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Nick followed them again, just as he had before, but this time, his heart pounded not with fear or hesitation, but with a grim, bone-chilling determination. They were laughing, Oblivious to the world, holding hands as they strolled toward the hotel, their sanctuary of betrayal. This time, Nick knew there was no turning back. He lurked in the shadows, his fingers grazing the cold metal of the gun hidden beneath his coat. He stayed still until they vanished inside, then made his move. Every step brought him closer to the reckoning he had meticulously planned for days. As he slipped into the hotel, the front desk clerk didn't even glance his way, absorbed in paperwork. Nick moved through the lobby with a singular focus, his eyes darting through the hallways until he spotted the room number etched into his mind. The door was ajar, their voices muffled but unmistakable. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he stood before the door, knuckles bone white from gripping the gun under his coat. Every moment that had led him to this point flashed through his mind, a recurring nightmare he couldn't escape. The lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, all converged into this instant. A line had been crossed within him, one he knew could never be retraced. There was no going back. He could hear them inside, their laughter carrying through the crack in the door, carefree, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Allison's laughter, once his greatest joy, now twisted in his gut like a blade. That laugh had once been his comfort, his happiness. Now, it was the final straw. Nick knocked on the door. The hollow sound echoed down the hallway, a dull, ominous thud that vibrated through his core. His heart pounded like a war drum, each beat slower than the last. Time stretched thin, every second feeling like an eternity as he stood there, knowing this was the moment of no return. The door creaked open, revealing the younger man standing in the doorway, his face shifting from surprise to confusion. Their eyes locked for a moment, and Nick saw the man's realization just before he forced his way into the room. The younger man stumbled back, but Nick was relentless, already pulling the gun from his coat. Allison sat on the bed, her back to the door. When the commotion reached her, she spun around, her face going pale as she saw Nick, gun raised and aimed. Her scream shattered the air, a sound of pure terror that seemed to freeze everything. "Nick! What are you doing?" she shrieked, voice trembling with fear. Nick's grip tightened on the gun, his voice cold, unfamiliar even to himself. "You think you can walk all over me?" he growled. "You think you can laugh in my face and get away with it?" The younger man took a cautious step forward, hands up, as if trying to calm the situation. Nick swung the gun toward him, halting him in place. "Don't move," Nick hissed, eyes burning with fury. Allison scrambled off the bed, her face a mask of panic. "Nick, we can talk about this. Please, let's just talk," she pleaded, desperation leaking into her voice. A bitter laugh escaped Nick, filling the room with an impending sense of doom. "Talk? There's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice." The younger man raised his hands higher, trying to speak in a calm, soothing tone, though his fear was evident. "Look, man, we didn't mean for this to happen. Let's just cool down and—" "Shut up!" Nick's voice exploded, finger twitching on the trigger. The weight of betrayal, anger, and humiliation bore down on him. The gun in his hand felt like the only thing keeping him grounded. "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn." Without warning, Nick pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, a deafening crack that reverberated through the small hotel room. The younger man's body jerked as the bullet hit him, and he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The room seemed to tilt, narrowing down to the sight of the man's lifeless body at Nick's feet. Allison's scream cut through the silence, raw and filled with horror. She rushed to the younger man, hands desperately pressing on the wound, but it was useless. The light in his eyes was already fading. She looked up at Nick, tears streaking her face, her hands stained red. "Please, Nick," she sobbed. "I'm sorry. Don't do this. We can fix it." But there was no reasoning with him anymore. Nick was beyond any plea, lost in the cold, consuming need for retribution. Everything he had lost weighed on him, pressing down like a vice. He raised the gun once more, this time steadier, his voice eerily calm. "You destroyed us," he said, barely above a whisper. "Now, you live with the consequences." Allison's eyes widened, her cries turning into desperate, terrified wails, but it was too late. Nick squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was final, an echo of a life shattered. Allison crumpled beside her lover, the two of them lying together in death, as they had in betrayal. the room plunged into silence, heavy and suffocating. Nick stood there, numb, staring at the scene he had created. He had taken everything from them, just as they had taken everything from him. Now, there was nothing left. Just moments ago, the room had been alive with chaos, fear, and violence. Now, only a deathly stillness remained, broken only by the soft, rhythmic drip of blood pooling beneath the bodies. The oppressive quiet seemed to press down on him, as if the walls themselves were closing in. For a few agonizing moments, Nick was frozen. His mind struggled to absorb the reality of his actions. Numb to the full consequences of crossing a line that could never be redrawn, the finality of it all hit him like a tidal wave. There was no undoing this. But through the fog of shock, a single thought emerged with terrifying clarity. He had to leave. Soon the police would arrive, and once they did, there would be no escape. The weight of his crime would come crashing down, and there would be no justification for the blood on his hands. Snapping out of his trance, Nick moved with an eerie detachment. He retrieved a handkerchief from his pocket and meticulously wiped the gun clean, erasing any trace of his presence. Placing the weapon gently next to the bodies felt oddly final, yet hollow, as though the act did little to absolve him. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder that time was running out. He couldn't linger. Without so much as a glance back, Nick turned and slipped out of the room, closing the door with a soft, deliberate click. The sound echoed in the hallway, magnified by the stillness that enveloped him. His feet moved quickly, but his mind raced even faster, adrenaline coursing through him. Every sound seemed louder, every movement more acute. As he entered the lobby, he forced himself to slow down, to appear calm, to blend in. The last thing he could afford was to draw attention. The hotel staff, blissfully unaware of the horror above, continued their routines as if nothing had happened. Nick crossed the lobby with an air of eerie calm, his face expressionless, his pace measured. He exited the hotel and headed straight for his car, parked several blocks away. His heart still pounded, but his mind had already shifted gears, planning his next steps. He drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the city lights blending into an indistinct blur as he sped through the streets. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, regret, and grim resolve. Going home wasn't an option. That place, once filled with memories, was now tainted by betrayal and the blood of those memories. He had only one choice. He had to disappear. Nick steered his car toward the outskirts of the city, where dense forests swallowed the roads and silence reigned. The remote area was part of the plan, a place he had scouted in the event things went this far. He pulled over and stepped out, each footfall taking him farther from the remnants of his shattered life. The contingency plan he never thought he'd need was now his only salvation. A secret bank account, a fake passport. Everything he'd prepared for in a worst-case scenario was now falling into place. At the edge of the woods, Nick paused, casting one last glance back at the road, a final goodbye to the life he was leaving behind. He moved swiftly toward the nearest airport, his actions smooth and practiced, as though operating on autopilot. The fake passport felt alien in his hand, a stark reminder that he was now stepping into a new existence, one defined by running, hiding, and the haunting memory of what he had done. He purchased a one-way ticket to a faraway country, a place where he could disappear completely, leaving behind the wreckage of his old life. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the night sky, Nick stared out the window, watching the city shrink and fade into the distance. Only now did the enormity of his actions begin to fully sink in, a crushing weight that settled deep in his chest. But there was no going back. He had made his choice, and now he would live with it, far from everything he once knew, far from the man he once was. Nick tried to settle into his new life, a life he had carefully constructed to be far removed from the ruins of his old one. Every aspect of his former identity had been erased. His hair, now a different color and cut short, replaced the familiar look he'd had for years. His once rugged face was now clean-shaven, abandoning the beard that had been part of his appearance for so long. He went by a new name and carried a fabricated backstory, blending into the anonymity of a small, remote town tucked away in the mountains of South America. It was the kind of place where outsiders went unnoticed and where no one would think to look for him. The town itself was quiet, inhabited by people who preferred their own company and rarely asked questions. That suited Nick just fine. He wasn't interested in forging new connections or becoming part of the local community. Instead, he worked as a handyman, fixing up the aging houses scattered around the town. The hard labor kept him busy, and the isolation mirrored his need for solitude. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect refuge. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, Nick's mind was in turmoil. The weight of his actions haunted him like a specter, especially when the sun dipped below the horizon and the town fell into silence. Alone in the darkness, he was left with only his thoughts. The memories of that night, the night when he had crossed an irrevocable line, replayed in a relentless loop. Allison's face, frozen in shock, haunted him. The deafening echo of the gunshots reverberated in his mind, and even in sleep, he couldn't escape the sound. He spent countless nights lying awake, staring blankly at the ceiling of his sparsely furnished room. The guilt gnawed at him, an ever-present companion that refused to leave. The fleeting satisfaction he had felt after the killings had long evaporated, leaving behind a void, an emptiness that seemed to expand with each passing day. He had sought revenge, but now, in the cold light of reflection, it all seemed meaningless. In his rage, he had not only destroyed Allison's life, but his own as well. The love they once shared, the life they had built, it was all reduced to ashes by a moment of uncontrollable anger. During the day, Nick tried to bury these thoughts beneath the routine of his new life, immersing himself in work. But no matter how hard he tried, the memories lingered, waiting to ambush him when his mind wandered. As he walked through the town or repaired an old roof, his thoughts would drift back to the life he had abandoned. He thought about the daughters he would never see again, the friends who would never know what had really happened to him. He had managed to escape the law, but he couldn't escape the prison he had built for himself in his own mind. In rare moments of clarity, Nick wondered if redemption was even possible. He had fled to avoid facing the legal consequences, but the true punishment was the torment he carried inside. The realization that he had become a murderer, that he had allowed his pain and anger to drag him into such darkness, weighed on him like a stone. No amount of distance could lighten that burden. As the weeks blurred into months, Nick fell into the rhythm of his new life. Yet the guilt never eased. It was always there, a silent reminder of the price he had paid for his moment of vengeance. He had lost everything: his family, his home, and most painfully, his sense of who he once was. And deep down, he knew that this was the real punishment. He could run from the world, hide from the authorities, but he could never escape the man he had become,